On behalf of Orchid and Williams Mullen, as well as our sponsors, we'd like to thank the over 350 people who've registered for today's session. For the next 90 minutes, we're going to talk about a very important subject that's shaping our industry, ATF ruling 2021R-05, which is titled Definition of a Frame or Receiver and Identification of Firearms. That being said, the ruling itself is far more than just definitions, as we'll discuss over the next 90 minutes. Last week, Orchid and Williams Mullen hosted the annual Firearms Industry Conference. We were honored to be joined by the top 20 ATF executives who use the platform as a means to educate many FFLs. In addition to our own legal and operational interpretation of the ruling, this webinar was influenced by those on-site discussions as well. As a general housekeeping note, we'll be answering questions throughout the presentation. Please use either your chat or Q&A feature to submit the questions, as everyone's line is going to be muted. Additionally, the session is going to be recorded, and afterwards, we're going to send out a link so that you and your organizations can rewatch this at your own leisure. All right, on the line with me today, I have attorney Chuck James from Williams Mullen, attorney Camden Webb, also from Williams Mullen, attorney Phil Milks, who leads our regulatory services practice at Orchid, and the lead attorney in FFL Law, could not join us today, but he did participate in presenting and preparing, I should say, much of the material. And myself, John Rydberg, CEO and co-founder of Orchid LLC. We'd also like to take a moment to introduce both hosts. Starting with Orchid, it's a 10-year-old company dedicated to the firearms industry. We offer 4 products, including FFL technology, firearm industry specific payment processing, ATF import, export, compliance services, and then education as well. I would say over the last 10 years, we've likely consulted for far more firearm manufacturers than any other organization. And honestly, our team has performed mock inspections of likely well over 100 million transactions. As a technology provider, our eBound and ERP solutions are processing more than 1 million transactions per month and integrate with 7 ERP systems and laser marking vendors. From a retail perspective, we're proud to have introduced Orchid POS and Orchid eCommerce this last year, now integrated with Ammo Ready, 8 distributors, and we provide transaction processing through 3 gun-friendly banks. Additional integrations will be announced shortly. Last but not least, we're proud to be a patron member of NSSF and partners with NESGW, ASA, and the NRA Business Alliance.
John, thank you. This is Camden Webb, and I am joining you, part of Williams Mullen's Firearms Industry Group. My law partner, Chuck James, is with us as well, and we lead the group. Just a brief couple notes about Williams Mullen. We are a full-service law firm. Our geographical base is on the East Coast between Washington, D.C. and down to South Carolina, but our Firearms Industry Practice Group is a nationwide practice. We provide the regulatory compliance, legal advice, import and export legal advice, ATF legal advice. We also have a whole range of services we provide to the industry, which is summarized here. We have approximately 250 attorneys practicing in all sorts of areas of business law, and we specialize in the industry, and we are very much industry friendly, which makes us a unique solution for industry members in this day and age. We provide the legal services and the legal work, which actually complements the compliance work that Orchid does, and we've worked very well with Orchid over the years. We've been in this game for quite a number of years and helped out clients in every segment of the industry. John, thank you for the moment to mention my firm, and we look forward to this presentation.
Thanks, Camden. Thanks for being a great partner. Next, I'd like to thank our sponsors today, which includes Guns.com, Ammo Ready, and FFL Law. Guns.com and Ammo Ready are 2 of the industry's leading technology companies. They provide FFLs with the best access to attract online shoppers, connect dealers with live distributor inventory, and help them grow sales online. FFL Law is actually Orchid's sister company. It's led by attorney Phil Milks, who also leads our regulatory services practice, as I mentioned before. And I just wanted to give a reach out to all three sponsors. Thank you very much for making this happen. Nothing in this presentation should be interpreted as legal advice. The information in this presentation is not intended to substitute professional legal advice and does not create an attorney-client privilege. If you need legal assistance, you should seek professional legal counsel and establish that attorney-client relationship. The other thing I'd like to note is, given that we're looking at presentation slides, most, if not all, of the ATF definitions that we're going to cover today have been abbreviated or paraphrased in some fashion. We definitely encourage you to read the entire definition that can be found in the rule and in the regulation. So let's talk about a summary of the actual ruling itself. It was initially posted April 26, 2022, and there's 6 sections to what was actually posted in the Federal Register. Executive summary, a background, notice of proposed rulemaking, analysis from the ATF and other government agencies, basically in responding to all of the industry's comment letters that were submitted. The actual final rule itself, 2021R-05, which starts on page 76, should you find yourself wanting to actually read it, and then statutory and executive order review at the end. The ruling becomes effective 120 days from the day that it was posted in the register, which happens to be August 24th, 2022. And I think there's one other important date to note. Privately made firearms, or PMFs, as we'll further define later in the presentation, if you are a licensee and you're holding any PMF inventory as of that August 24 date, you have 60 days to market in accordance with the methods that we'll describe later. And that date is October 23, 2022. It's important that we let everybody know there are still some open questions that remain that we, Orchid, Williams Mullen have. I think NSF has some, and I'm sure many of you who have read the ruling are wondering about the practical applications of some of the things that are in there. I do that ATF is working to answer those actual questions. As you'll see here on the next slide, oh, sorry, 2 slides from now, you're going to see the impact across the entire industry as we look at a layout by FFL type. But just before we get there, the actual ruling itself that I mentioned starting on page 76 is broken down into 5 parts. And these 5 parts are going to become the outline for the remainder of the presentation that we have here today. So that's definition, subparts A through G, markings, which is subpart H, record keeping, which is subpart I, record retention, subpart J, and then the effect of prior ATF rulings and procedures, what's been superseded or amplified, which is in subpart K. So this was the slide I was talking about, and it's not intended for everybody in this webinar to read this. And as I said, we're going to make the recording available so you can look at this after. But I just wanted to show relative impact to all the FFL types and even others who serve the FFLs, such as a software vendor. And the majority of the rule really impacts manufacturing. But as you can see, it impacts everybody. Subcontract manufacturing, outside processing, retail, e-commerce, gunsmithing, software vendors, and those who import firearms as well. And we've got a little mention of some export matters coming up in a minute. But significant impact to the industry's manufacturing sector. One other note about the presentation scope itself, we're not really addressing anything here that would pertain to somebody in the ammo piercing, ammunition, collectors, or personal firearms collection sector of our industry. These are some of the open questions which will be more clear as the presentation continues. The first of which relates to the definition of new model. And this contextually relates to a marking requirement in that firearms of a new model type, defined later, as of August 24th, will need to be marked in a new manner. The granularity of functional change is not well known. I mean, ATF does lay out what new model means in terms of functionality versus cosmetic, but such an open question might be if I have to change an internal screw or a spring, Does that mean my marking method completely changes? Another open question relates to new definitions of readily. Many of you probably heard of the term readily convertible, and there's also a term called clearly identifiable. Both of these terms primarily relate to what the ATF, or excuse me, what the industry has always called 80%ers, which clearly ATF does not recognize that term, but they use readily and clearly identifiable as what I believe to be, kind of generic measures of whether or not something is going to be a firearm or not, or considered to be a firearm. The time to mark frames and receivers in the manufacturing process changes significantly. It may have an impact on what we commonly call change in form. For example, if you're converting a receiver to that of a rifle or a frame to a pistol, that may or may not go away. The other markings, which the definition of other markings has changed as well, and now includes manufacturer, city, and state alongside serial numbers. Contextually, that'll make more sense in a moment too. Has an impact on polymer frames, privately made firearms. So for example, polymer frames would always deploy a permanently molded metal plate in the actual frame itself, with additional markings being required in metal. There's a question as to the practicality of whether or not those plates will be able to hold those markings. And then I suppose one other minor one too is ATF has come up with an alternative marking strategy as an option, and it's presented 3 times in the presentation. And in one of the 3 times, the alternative marking is preceded with the letters FFL, and the other 2 aren't. So that's just some of the open questions. Again, these will make more context in just a little bit. But the one thing I really want to say on this slide is I think the moving of the markings to that of a frame or receiver on quote unquote new models could be one of the most material impacts of this entire ruling. Some things on the horizon have nothing to do with this particular ruling, but it's important to bring them up. So the ATF is still working on a digital storage ruling that will make it so that you don't have to submit a variance to be able to store 4473s electronically. The stabilizing brace, which I believe will be somewhat controversial, is still forthcoming. And we were informed that the Form 9, which previously required approval from ATF, will become a notification. We do not have dates of effectivity for any of these things just yet. And finally, in our executive summary, I think we would be remiss if we didn't talk about zero tolerance expectations. And for those of you who were at the Firearms Industry Conference last week, clearly heard ATF on stage talking about this. Many of them did say, I think casually but professionally, they didn't necessarily agree with all this. It was being pushed down by the administration, but they are being forced to take a zero tolerance approach to the industry. And that licensees who basically trip up in any of these 5 areas could be brought to revocation. And they are failure to permit an ATF inspection. So if you prohibited the ATF from coming in, I suppose that makes sense to some degree. Failure to respond to a trace request, transfer of a firearm to a prohibited person, falsifying your records, and then failure to properly conduct background checks prior to the transfer of a firearm. I will go further to say that ATF mentioned on stage, there are some exceptions to these rules, of course. There are some state background check processes that may force transfer beyond the next 30-day period. So some things will be taken into consideration. But regardless, the tone has been set. And what this means is now more than ever is a time for FFL training, strengthening your internal controls, and conducting your own internal audits to make sure that your compliance environment is up to snuff. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chuck James, who's going to walk us through the definitions. Chuck, I believe you are muted.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully I'm coming through loud and clear. John, thank you for that overview of today's session. And like Camden, I want to join in thanking you for your longstanding friendship and the partnership between Orchid and Williams Mullen. So my role here today is to walk through several of the most important definitions as found in the new rule and regulation. And to orient us, we have on this first slide where those can be found. So we're going to jump right in. The first one is going to be an overview of the definition of these changes. So we have the CFR, that's 27 CFR Part 478-.11, which defines a firearm, whereas -12 is going to reference frame and receiver. And before we go any further, many of us who have been in the industry for some time now have gotten used to saying frame or receiver, because the two things were largely overlapping and meant the same thing. But we're all going to have to retrain ourselves a little bit to say frame and receiver. And the general rule going forward is that a frame is going to reference a pistol. A receiver is going to represent or reference a long gun. There may be some exceptions to that, but we are going to have to change the way we speak. A frame will have one definition, a receiver another. One typically references a pistol, one a long gun. Other things we're going to be looking at and defining here are what constitutes a complete weapon or a complete muffler. And for purposes of today's presentation, I will use muffler, silencer, suppressor, use those terms interchangeably. We'll also talk about something John noted, excuse me, readily. And that's going to be a big open question for a while. What is readily convertible? But we'll get a little bit of insight, perhaps not enough to give us all the level of comfort as to what that means as we get into some of the parts kits and jig sets that have become so common in the last several years in the marketplace, particularly for those individuals who have bought them and made their own privately made firearms, also known as PMFs, both generally and in this presentation. We'll also hit on the definitions and the importance of an importer or a manufacturer serial number, and what it is to be a gunsmith, and really what that entitles a gunsmith to do, and how that may be different from a licensed gun manufacturer. Thanks, John. So let's jump into it with a firearm. On the left-hand side for this and the subsequent slides, we'll have what is the definition as it's shown by the ATF's rule and or regulation, and then the key takeaway that we want you to have here. As John said earlier, this is not legal advice. These are summaries. Sometimes these definitions have been abbreviated, and we want you to keep that in mind. And a lot of these things are going to be very fact specific. But we do want to say, here's what the definition is, and here's at least a key takeaway that you should have as you examine your own policies, procedures, and operations. So some things have not changed. We're still looking at a weapon or a starter gun, which is designed to expel a projectile. So those are all things that are very familiar to us historically. We're also looking at a firearm muffler or silencer. So that's going to be defined as a firearm, as would any destructive device. But what's not included is an antique firearm. And so when you look at, is this thing I have, this object, is it a firearm? At what point does a hunk of metal or a hunk of polymer become a firearm? The ATF has put some additional language around that. And really what their focus seems to be is largely on two things. At what point a blank or a billet or some precursor element becomes a firearm. And the other one that has certainly garnered significant attention is at what point does a incomplete component, when coupled with a jig kit or a weapons part kit, become a firearm. And so their definition includes that a parts kit is designed or may be readily completed, assembled, restored, or converted to expel a projectile. So to the extent you've historically been able to go online to buy a jig, to buy a frame for a pistol, and to make your own privately manufactured firearm in the comfort of your own home, that kit will now be regulated as a firearm, though incomplete, though without certain manufacturing steps having been completed. The rationale being it can be readily converted into a functioning and firing firearm. And if there's one thing we heard repeatedly from the ATF during both our public and public meetings and large forums and one-offs elsewhere, is they've taken the view that these kits allow someone with nominal machining skills, nominal tools, if any, outside of maybe a drill and some bits, to make a firearm. And therefore, they are viewing those things when aggregated as a firearm. What it does not include are going to be just that weapons part kit where the frame or receiver has been destroyed. And so those are going to be a different case. So next, a complete firearm in this case will include the firearm or the muffler or silencer. And again, I'm going to use those interchangeably for purposes of this conversation. And that's going to be the same whether or not it's assembled or operable. So again, if you think of something in the life cycle of a firearm or the life cycle of a suppressor, both of which are going to be defined as firearms, they have moved the born date earlier. At an earlier stage of manufacturing, at an earlier stage of production, it is now going to be defined a firearm, whereas before it was a parts kit, before it was a tube or an end cap or some baffles in the case of a suppressor. And again, in the case of the suppressor or silencer, the key phrase here is it's going to apply whether or not it is assembled or operable. So whether it's functioning isn't really going to matter. It's going to be, do you have the requisite parts all pulled together? And you're going to have to note these parts kits must be sold and serialized and recorded appropriately. Thanks, John. And next.
Chuck, it should be on the frame slide. Are you seeing that?
I believe we may have a little bit of a lag here. Anyway,
I'm going to just unshare real quick and then reshare. Bear with me.
Sure. There we go. Great. Thank you, John. So next, let's talk about the definitions of a frame or receiver. As I said before, rule of thumb is frame is going to be a pistol, receiver is going to reference a long gun with some exceptions. So the frame is going to be the housing or the structure that is primarily the energized component. Think of the place that holds the hammer, the striker, the bolt, or the similar components up to and including the sear. It's the operating functional machine part of the firearm. And one of the things that I'm glad the ATF did, there's some that I'm not thrilled with either personally or professionally, but one of the things I appreciated about their publication is the inclusion of some of the photographs. And so here's one drawn straight from the ATF that makes clear in a very traditional semi-automatic pistol that the lower half or lower portion is the frame. That's where the key mechanical operations of the trigger, the bolt, and the striker are all found. Whereas the upper part, which is not the frame, would contain things like the barrel and parts of the slide, etc. And all of this is going to apply whether or not the pins are attached or are required. And this clarifies in the view of the ATF that a frame, what the frame is for a number of handguns and their variants, and allows them for a better definition of chassis type frames. All of which, as John noted, is going to implicate a number of things, particularly with polymer firearms and privately made firearms, what has to be marked, where it has to be marked, and the level of detail for those markings. And we'll touch on that in some of the material that John will cover later on in the presentation. Next, moving on. So there are a number of variants also which have some very helpful photographs here. By way of example only, you've got the SIG P250 and the 320. Whereas the lower grip and trigger housing and trigger guard and all the rest, your rails for your accessories on the SIG P250, would, if it were another firearm, say the Glock in the upper right-hand corner, that would be the frame. But given the ergonomics and the makeup and the engineering of the SIG P250 and the 320, the way that I'll call it fire control group is made and drops in, unlike some others, that is deemed the firearm. It's that part that you can see there, kind of small, marked as frame. That's what's going to have to be serialized and would require a 4473 for a transfer, whereas a very similar component for the Ruger Mark IV or the Glock, as shown above, would be the serialized item. So these are some of the variants that are going to be exceptions to the rule. Again, in the Ruger Mark IV, the frame as defined here is actually going to be the upper assembly that includes the barrel, whereas in the Glock, it's going to be the lower, and in the SIG P250, it's going to be that fire control group, that drop-in mechanical part there. And for the folks that like wheel guns, you've got a hinge receiver or a traditional revolver, in which case it is in fact the frame that we know it and have always understood it to be that is marked. So do be careful and look for those exceptions. And there's some helpful photographs in the presentation, as well as in the original ATF document. Receiver, that's the housing or the structure, that's the primary component, including the seal designed to block or to seal the breach and initiate the firing sequence. Again, just like before, as we talked about frames, whether the pins are present or necessary will not be important. And again, separate definitions for frame or receiver. We'll have to break ourselves of our long history of saying frame or receiver. They have two different definitions and will mean different things going forward. And John's going to talk a lot more about the marking implications of that as we move forward. So, still talking about frame or receiver, we have a number of other variants now talking about some of our long guns and more modern sporting rifles and the AR platform in particular. That was one that caused a lot of concern early on as to what would be done as it relates to the AR platform and the stripped lowers or the completed lowers that we have known, because that really seems to be the genesis for a lot of that. One of the things that various ATF staff referenced during the course of our interaction before, during, and after the conference were the challenges of dealing with the reality that a stripped lower for an AR-15 may not meet the definition of a firearm. And in fact, some criminal cases, they feel they lost because there was a misalignment of the traditional understanding of an AR lower being a firearm and the definition. And so to address that, they've expanded the definition to bring the AR clearly within the ambit of a firearm. So that's one of the variations that we need to be mindful of, as it is such a prevalent firearm and weapons platform. So to be clear, the lower part of that weapon that provides the housing for the trigger mechanism, as it has always been, is going to be the receiver. And you see that in the example there. That's the very traditional stripped lower, that silhouette that we know so well. That will remain serialized and be the firearm, but they make clear that that has always been the intent, not just the practice. But some other interesting variants have come along or needed to be addressed in their view, and those include the ones noted here, where you have a box-type firearm and or, as an example, the Spinelli 121, where the receiver is deemed the lower part, not unlike that of an AR-15, despite the fact that many of the components that might otherwise make it a receiver are actually found in the upper half there, aligned with the barrel. So again, this is a very fact-specific analysis. These are some examples that the ATF has drawn out. And my guess is, given the number of firearms and designs out there, there may well be other firearms not referenced here that will require some additional information and maybe a determination by the ATF. Again, more receiver variants. We've got the Tommy gun, the HK MP5, some bolt actions, and the FN FAL, all of which have exceptions to the rule. But if you look at these and you understand at least the ATF's logic and thinking here, all of these firearms have the receiver defined as that portion that contains the fire control mechanisms. There are reasons there are variants and exceptions here, but if you accept their premise, you can understand why these are some of these variants and why they all have their receiver defined as they do here. Additional receiver variants, there we go. Thank you, John. So let's turn from firearms in the strictest sense, that is rifles, pistols, and look at suppressors or mufflers. Some interesting things here is that firearm is defined as the outer tube or the modular piece that provides a housing or structure. This does not include, and this is important, does not include the removable end cap of an outer tube. For those of you that like to shoot, suppress, shoot cans, you probably have had not just a baffle strike if you've done this enough, you may well have had an issue with your end cap. And so it's important to note that the end cap is not, does not have to be serialized under their analysis. And so those things can be swapped out, replaced, repaired, etc., without some of the other challenges that you would otherwise have with a serialized part. In the case of a modular silencer, that is one where you have a part that attaches to the threaded barrel of a firearm with additional portions that can extend that barrel, or sorry, extend that length of that can, if you will. Only the portion that attaches to the barrel is going to be the firearm here, and only that portion needs to be serialized. And so that's an important thing to remember as well. Go to the next one. We may have another lag here. While John is bringing that up, what we're going to be talking about next are going to be the frame or receiver as it relates to a multi-piece. Now, this is, as you can see here, a very traditional silhouette of a stripped lower for an AR-15. There are some out there on the marketplace that were in two pieces. That is a multi-piece frame or receiver. And so in this case, that term is going to include that receiver where it can be disassembled into multiple parts and the standardized units that may be replaced or exchanged. So to be clear, to the extent you have an AR lower that could be split in half and comes in modular split pieces, each side will have to be serialized, and they will also have to have the same number. So if you have serial number on the left-hand side, that is James manufacturer 1234-X, the other side will also have to be serialized James 1234-X as well. And that's meant to address these, what to happen when you have two pieces that could be brought together, what number should be affixed to those, and frankly, what happens if there is some sort of issue at a gunsmith or repair or warranty requires you to fix or repair one side of the firearm and not the other. The short answer is the markings have to match, and John will touch on that later on as well.
Chuck, I'd like to also take a minute to answer the first question that's come in.
Please.
What's that?
Yes, please.
One of our participants asked, does a lower parts kit for an AR lower receiver count as a firearm if the parts kit only includes the pin, springs, trigger, and hammer, i.e. what is determined to be the receiver now is not included? No, it does not. You know, the inclusion of the receiver is the key part of that weapons part kit. So hopefully that helps.
Absolutely right. Yeah, thanks, John. So continuing with the frame or receiver, again, it's important to note those of us who are hobbyists, weekend shooters, or follow these things from afar, the term 80% lower or 80% anything is not a term that is recognized by the ATF, nor is it included in any of their previous guidance. It has become very common in the marketplace. I use it. We all use the term 80%, but as a legal matter, it has very little or any relevance or teeth to it. And so what the ATF has attempted to do here is add to their understanding of what is a firearm and where it happens. So again, policy differences aside, the reality is that the rule as it stands now is a receiver is designed or may be readily completed, assembled, restored, or otherwise converted. And so what has historically been talked about in the marketplace as an 80% receiver, when paired with a parts kit and or a jig kit will now be deemed a firearm. Those components, those things, when put together, and I don't mean physically assembled on a bench, but I mean when sold together, when marketed together, when shipped together, will be deemed a firearm, and will have to go through an FFL, and will have to have an end user fill out a 4473 and comply with their states and or the federal requirements for the transfer of a firearm through an FFL. We'll talk more about what exactly readily looks like, but to be clear, an 80%, as we have known it or spoken about it colloquially, will be a firearm under the federal definitions moving forward. So how do we know when something is readily convertible? Well, they've given us some help, but as John noted at the outset, there are significant questions that still remain here, where the ATF is simply going to have to provide some additional guidance to industry so that we can know where the lines are. Whether we like a particular rule or not, we all want to know where the line is so that we don't cross it unintentionally. But the guidance that we have now includes a number of factors that are laid out here. Things like, how much time does it take to finish the process? One of the things that we heard from ATF executives were examples of sometimes in their meetings as they were going through the process, buying a parts kit, buying a lower, buying a jig set, and making a firearm in the ATF headquarters, and how long it took folks of various skill levels to do it. And I must have heard it 2 or 3 times. There was a story of someone making a firearm in 12 minutes, and they said, that is readily convertible. So how long it takes to finish the process with a normal skill set and the usual tools of a jig and drill and bits and the like is a key factor for them. How easy is it to do? What level of expertise? To the extent you can be a gunsmith and do it, that's very different from if you're a layman that doesn't have any specialized skills or tools. How available are the parts? Do you have to manufacture and create a part, or are they sold together in a convenient kit? How much does it cost? The extent to which the process changes the finished product, and whether the process would damage or destroy the subject. And so the more turnkey these kits are, the easier they are to do, the more likely the ATF is to find that your item, for lack of a better term, is in fact readily convertible and therefore deemed a firearm. And one of the things that we're going to have to get some more clarity on is the term clearly identifiable, as was on the prior slide. That's going to leave a little bit more meat on the bone, and we'll have to work with the ATF, and ATF is committed to working with industry to clarify some of those ambiguities.
Chuck, I'm going to field another question in here from anonymous attendee. If you were to purchase the 80%er, if you will, on one transaction, the jig parts to complete it on another, does this still considered a firearm? I can tell you we had considerable debate with ATF about 80%ers, if you will, during the conference, and their continued response was, there's no such thing as an 80%er, can't answer the question, right? And I think what they were trying to get at, and actually they explicitly pointed out, is look at the new definition. The new definition, other than the fact readily and clearly identifiable still being open, says that there's no such thing as an 80%er, and it's based upon, you know, what that actual hunk of metal can do. I mean, the only thing that they explicitly excluded were castings and forgings, you know, to which there really had been no machining completed yet. So, you know, the jigs and the parts being purchased separately doesn't keep it from being a firearm. Another question that came in is, you know, relates to the
Hey, John, can I pause you there? Just add a couple points to that before you move on.
Absolutely.
Yeah, in some of those conversations, what became clear to me, and my background for those that don't know is as a federal prosecutor, what became clear to me is ATF is going to do a couple of things. One, any number of, they don't recognize 80%, and what may be deemed 80% completion by manufacturer A may or may not be the same 80% level of completion by manufacturer B. And so some industry participants may see it helpful to submit to FAT-D a number of prototypes, if you will, to establish at what point the ATF views those as firearms. The other thing is they're going to look to the specific facts. Any attempt to bifurcate, to separate the parts kit from the so-called 80%, if it is deemed evasive or being too loose with the facts, they're going to look at that. And the comment was made to me a couple times in public and private forums. They're going to look at that very closely and look to the intent of the parties, the intent of the seller, the intent of the buyer, and ultimately whether or not that's a violation may be decided by an assistant United States attorney, which is a way of saying, we may have some proof problems on this, but we're going to explore this in certain cases. So, John, I'm sorry, please move on to the other question.
No, no worries. And there's a couple here. I'll try and hit them rapid fire. Somebody asked, does a chassis kit, such as an MDT chassis, now classify as a receiver? I believe the answer is no, because it doesn't include the actual chassis itself. So it's the chassis, much like the last question I answered, if it's absent the frame or the receiver and just all of the other parts, then that kit is not considered a firearm. It has to have the frame or receiver to be considered a firearm. The next question was, isn't putting the same markings on two different pieces of a split receiver create duplicate items and entries in the bound book? That is one of the open questions that we have for ATF. You'll see as we get deeper into the presentation, there are a couple other bound book implications based upon the new ruling. So stay tuned on that particular one. Back to you, Chuck.
Yeah, please. Thank you. So let's move to the next slide. Continuing with the frame or receiver, whether due to a manufacturing defect or whether it was testing, we have cases where you'll need to destroy a frame or receiver. And their definition is where something has been permanently altered such that it cannot be readily completed or assembled. And there are some acceptable methods for that. Those include melting, crushing, or shredding, or other methods that are approved by the director. And so there's some specific language in the rule that speaks to method of destruction and gives some clarity on that.
Chuck, if I may, I've got a couple more questions here from the group.
Yes, let's.
I figured this section of the presentation was going to have a bunch of them. The individual asked, just a point of clarification, so a lower receiver and an upper receiver that are sold together in a builder set need to have matching serial numbers, question mark? The answer is no, but let me be careful about this. The definition of the multi-piece receiver is where those two halves are the same thing, or they are identical, if you will. They would need to have the matching serial numbers. So in a traditional upper, as we know it, versus the actual lower receiver, as we know it, is not a multi-piece receiver. Those are two different parts of the completed gun, if you will.
Yeah, John, I think one helpful way, at least for me to think about it, and again, using the AR modern sporting rifle as the prototypical example, if you think of an AR that it's fully assembled, take out your pins, you can separate an upper from a lower. And I say that intentionally. I don't call it receiver, I didn't call it a frame, but in the AR platform, you can separate the upper from the lower. The upper that includes the barrel and the bolt carrier group and all the rest that will be in the upper are not now, nor were they defined as the firearm. In the AR platform, that upper is not serialized, does not need to be serialized now, never was serialized. That is going to remain the same. If you take your lower, remove your handguard, remove your buttstock, and remove your buffer tube, and you stripped it down to a stripped lower, that piece is your receiver, both under the old interpretation and the new rule. And when we're talking about a multi-piece, we're talking about taking that stripped lower and by design having it be in two pieces. Those two pieces collectively are the receiver, and because they can be separated, they have to be marked identically.
All right. Thank you. There are a number of other questions, but let's continue to move on and we'll answer them as we go.
Great. Let's see. Let's talk about privately made firearms. This was absolutely top of the list, both for consumers and seemed to be for the ATF as well. They seem to be mindful of the public concern about this area. And so for privately made firearms, let me start by saying something that ATF counsel said, and as did some of their other executives. Privately made firearms have been legal, will remain legal. And if I heard this multiple times, if I wanted to buy and or make 100 privately made firearms at my house, I am free to do so under the old interpretation as well as under the new rule. The distinctions are going to come in. What happens when that privately made firearm leaves the possession of its manufacturer, of its owner, of its creator, and goes to a licensee? So a firearm which includes the frame or receiver that is completed or assembled or otherwise produced by a person other than a licensed manufacturer, and that's the key. If you are an FFL of any sort, of any type, this does not apply to you. If you make a firearm as a licensee in your licensed capacity, you do not have, nor have you made a privately made firearm. This is for an unlicensed individual who makes one. Those folks may continue to make them. They need not serialize their firearm, and that hasn't changed. But there are significant ramifications for what happens to that firearm should you seek to transfer it and or should you seek to take it in for service to a licensed dealer. And as John said earlier, one of the major carve-outs or armor-piercing ammo carve-out here is NFA items. Those are in a category by themselves.
Yeah, and I will offer just one bit of clarification on this. So privately made firearms are applicable to licensees in the context that if you do have one or receive one or come in possession of one, there are new rules related to the PMFs. But Chuck is correct. If you are not a licensed manufacturer, and you are producing something for your own personal good, then that doesn't require a license, and that is definitely a PMF. So.
Very good. So now we move into what has to be serialized. And so the serial number has to be placed on this firearm, including on a privately made firearm in certain cases. So by definition, this definition makes it illegal to transport, ship, or receive a firearm with an obliterated serial number. And the name and the city and the state are some of the new requirements that are going to be both required to be on certain firearms, as well as would be part of what could otherwise be obliterated and cause the civil and criminal penalties if you're in possession of one of those. And I think we'll have more comment about markings here in a bit. And finally, well, not finally, but also, what is a gunsmith? And at what point does a gunsmith move from being a gunsmith to being someone who, in the ATF view, needs to have one of the various types of licenses as an FFL? So a licensed dealer gunsmith may purchase complete weapons, they can repair them, and they can resell them all without being a manufacturer. They can make the repairs for other licensees who plan to resell them without also becoming a licensed manufacturer. And finally, they can place marks on a PMF that they would then purchase or sell or under the direct supervision of another licensee. And so one of the examples that the ATF used in one of its roundtable sessions is if John Doe owns a trophy facility, trophy company, and as part of that makes trophies and can do engravings, he can, on occasion, as not his primary business, take in a firearm and engrave it consistent with the regulations and not have to register and not have to be an FFL. However, if he changes his business model and his business practice to be John's laser engraving, and trophy service, and advertises that he provides this service, he very well may run afoul of the law if he does not also does not also register and become an FFL. So occasional use as an ancillary service because you have the tools and the expertise will not require you to become a manufacturer, but that is a fact-specific analysis, and you should make sure that your advertising and your practices are in compliance with the regulations. And John, I'll let you take it with the markings.
All right, thank you, Chuck. Please note that we do have about 10 questions that have come in. We've been answering some of them live and some of them behind the scenes here. I will continue to have the group answer as we go, and anything that is not answered, we will make contact with you after the webinar to make sure you do get an answer. So let's go ahead and talk about markings from an overview perspective. There are some core marking requirements that have changed that will have a material impact, particularly on manufacturing, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. We're also going to talk about the multi-piece frames and receiver markings. Some of the questions that I see coming in will be answered during that section. The time to mark has changed. Privately made firearms, which have been defined by Chuck, adopting other marks, and then suppressor markings as well. So in my opinion, here's one of the biggies, right? So frame or receiver, as defined as such in the new ruling, must now be marked with additional information. You'll note the serial number, which has always been a requirement, but the addition of manufacturer name and city state of the place of their business, of course. ATF also adds an alternative marking method. I'm not sure who's going to use this method, but there's an alternative here, which is or manufacturer name and serial number, but the serial number isn't the serial number as you know it. It would be a unique identifier that consists of the first 3 digits and last 5 digits of your FFL, right, with a hyphen followed by the serial number. So you can see the example there. Let's say the serial number was ABC for argument's sake. It would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 hyphen serial number ABC. So those are 2 options. Now, so let's talk about where this becomes applicable. So one of the definitions that Chuck covered was new firearm designs. So new firearm designs are changes to existing firearms other than cosmetic changes, further defined there. You should definitely reference that. That are made and sold into commerce after the date of August 24th. One of the big follow-up points here again is, so ATF cites the term functional changes, but what is the granularity again of functional? So if I change an internal screw or spring or whatever it might be inside of the firearms, does that constitute entirely new marking, or excuse me, new firearm? If it does, then think about this from the perspective of being a manufacturer. You have engineering drawings, you have a bill of material, you have routings, you probably have fixtures if you're using some type of laser marking or other marking type that control all of this. That's a significant change. And from a polymer perspective, right, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, serial number had to be marked in metal. And now, if you look back at the definitions as well, that the manufacturer city state can't be readily obliterated it implies that those additional markings need to be put in metal. So I would assume most of the folks on this call have seen the metal inserts, for example, on the bottom of a polymer pistol. Well, those inserts for the serial number are pretty darn small. I don't know how that stuff's going to fit on there. So, we do have an open question as to whether or not, I guess, the practicality of this and how it's going to be implemented, and if for certain those polymer frames are definitely going to require all of those markings in metal. So take note of that. Here we go. So the multi-piece frames and receiver, right? So question came in, is it like an upper and a lower type combination? Well, no, not necessarily. It's similarly designed parts, right? So the best example here is you look at this receiver, and if it were a 2-part receiver, left and right, they would be similarly designed. Each of the subparts needs to be marked, and they need to be marked with the same serial number, as well as the other additional new markings such as manufacturer and city and state. Same kind of thing that could potentially have implications to toolings, routings, drawings, and so forth. If one of the halves, oh, I should also mention, by the way, the serial number that's on both sides has to be the same serial number, which is something that's new. And so somebody asked the question earlier and I answered, does that mean that two different entries are going to be put in the bound book? That is something that we are following up on. Now, if one of the parts becomes damaged or need to be repaired, ATF is saying that you are to use the exact same serial number, but that the original part has to be destroyed, and of course, under the control of the licensed manufacturer under their supervision. All right, so lots of questions on that one, and that's a big change for a lot of folks. Time to mark. So 7 days following ... the big change here, the entire manufacturing process, right? If you're in manufacturing, you understand what work in process is, or WIP. Whereas a frame and receiver that previously was intended to be included in an assembled pistol or rifle or shotgun, if you will, would have to be serialized and entered into the book 7 days from the point in time that it was readily convertible. The new definition is from the end of the entire manufacturing process. So ATF goes on to further state that firearms awaiting materials, parts, or equipment repair need to be completed or are presumed, absent reliable evidence to the contrary to be in the manufacturing process. So that's actually written almost in the licensee's favor, if you will. So if an IOI goes into the facility, hopefully they understand that particular piece of the language. And, if it's still in the manufacturing process, it doesn't need to be marked yet. One of the open questions that we have is, right, so when a frame gets converted to a handgun or revolver or receiver to a shotgun rifle, you would have a change in form transaction, right? Simultaneous disposition to myself as a licensee and a reacquisition. Open question is, does that mean the change in form goes away if I'm not marking it and recording it until after it's fully assembled, which would be the end of the manufacturing process? Don't know yet. We are hoping to hear back, but that could impact a lot of your routings, your ERP configuration, and for some of you, your bound book transactions as well. Privately made firearms, must be serialized no later than the 7th day. We're talking about for licensees naturally, but the 7th day following the receipt, but before disposition. So naturally, if it has to be serialized and you're going to send it to someone else, it has to be serialized before it goes back out. So the question is, how do you mark it? What's the new rule? So the licensee must apply their own unique serial number. And that consists of the first 3 and last 5 of your FFL number with a hyphen, and then a unique number that you define as a licensee that can never be duplicated. So if you look at that first 3, last 5 string with a unique number, it can't duplicate any other numbers that you have created, right? We are still trying to validate whether or not the other markings are going to be required for a PMF. Such as city and state and so forth. So that will come out in an upcoming webinar. So those of you who are licensed dealers might be scratching your head and say, hey, wait a minute, I get PMFs or I have PMFs on site and in my inventory. How am I going to mark them? I don't have any marking devices. Well, the ATF has made it possible for you to use a gunsmith or another licensee or somebody with a marking device to apply those markings for you, provided that they are marked under your supervision and there and returned back the same day. The person doing the marking of the PMF does not have to record it into their bound book. Now, if you happen to have PMFs in your inventory, it says currently, but really that should say, if you are a licensee and you have PMFs in your inventory as of the effectivity date of the ruling, which is August 24th, you have 60 days to mark those. And the 60-day point would be October 23rd. And of course, when I say marked, I should say marked and recorded. Oh, by the way, if the PMF had a serial number placed on it by whoever originally made it, let's say it was a non-licensee, you still have to add your own marking, that first 3, last 5 unique number. And here's the kicker. Think about this from your bound book perspective. Is that both numbers need to go into the single serial number slot in your bound book separated by a semicolon. I think some software packages will have no issue with that, such as Orchid eBound, that was a plug. But others may choke on that. So if you're using an electronic bound book, definitely suggest you talk to your software provider about that. All right, newly manufactured items. Licensed manufacturers may adopt a serial number and other identifying markings placed on them by another licensed manufacturer, provided it's not been sold, shipped, or otherwise disposed of to a person other than the licensee, so forth and so on. Well, what are we really talking about here? This is firearms that are sent for outside processing. So let's say that I am the manufacturer of a rifle and I make the receivers in-house, and I'm somewhere in the middle of my manufacturing process and I want to send it for outside processing. Well, if it's been marked, the individuals who are doing further manufacturing can adopt those numbers as they could under ruling 2009-5, but there's no notification required. So this supersedes 2009-5. Now, interesting conundrum. So ATF is effectively saying, if you send those receivers or frames for outside processing or some secondary process, the next person in the supply chain can adopt the marking. But they're also saying that the markings don't need to be applied till the end of the manufacturing process. I think if it is sent to a third party like that for further work, their intention is that it definitely needs to be marked before it's sent into commerce, but that's not clarified from what I've seen. Adopting others' marks as it relates to remanufactured firearms or imported firearms. Same thing, you may adopt the serial number or other markings previously placed on the firearm that has been sold, shipped, or otherwise disposed of to a person other than licensee, provided that when you receive them, you have to apply your name, city, and state, or, and here comes one of these alternative methods again, their name and abbreviated FFL. So first 3, last 5. Now you notice there's no hyphen after this one. There's no additional marking after this. And the other change here is that the 8-digit string is preceded by the characters FFL. So one of our open questions to ATF is, why do you have to put it here and not in the other instances, or vice versa, right? The number must not duplicate any serial number adopted or placed on the firearm unless the licensed importer receives 2+ firearms with the same foreign manufacturer's serial number. If that's the case, ATF is explicitly authorizing you to modify the serial number by adding another character, let's say an X, an A, some other multi-digit string. All right. Now we're going to talk about firearm muffler, silencer parts, and so forth. So may transfer a part defined as a firearm muffler or firearm silencer to another qualified manufacturer without immediately identifying or registering the part, provided that it was for further manufacturing and going into the finished good. Let me give an example. Let's pretend that I am Silencer Co. and I am purchasing components. They can be sent to me without marking and without registering them, provided that I'm producing the finished good and I'm the one who's going to ultimately mark the frame or receiver and register it. And keep in mind that I think Chuck defined, as we're talking about suppressor frames and receivers, the definition now says it's the outermost tube for a single piece, a suppressor, and for a modular item, it's the part that connects to the actual firearm. All right, so in our presentation, I think the ATF casually referred to this part of the supply chain as in the bubble, right? It's the subcontractor shipping to and from the end unit manufacturer. Of course, if you are if you are manufacturing components for a suppressor, and it is known that that's what they are for, right, you still need to have an FFL and an SOT. Okay, basically, the same applies here for suppressor parts that are replacements or for repair. So basically, they need not be marked prior to shipping to the individual who's going to be doing the replacement, the repair, and they need not be registered separately. All right. Just doing a quick time check here. Okay, now we're going to move on to record keeping. Core regulatory updates. So previously, most licensed manufacturers and importers consolidated their acquisition and disposition records. And by that, I don't mean consolidating their manufacturing bound book and their importing bound book. I mean that the acquisition, the left side of what shows up in the manufacturer book, and the disposition, which shows up in the right side of the bound book, would be consolidated into one row. The other thing that was in the ruling is that prior to commencing or continuing a firearm business, each licensed dealer shall inventory their firearms. So let's say you're going to acquire a retail business, you shall inventory the firearms. I think practically speaking, that's something that everybody would do anyways. Privately made firearms. So let's talk about record keeping of these. I had mentioned previously that if a licensed dealer needed to have some other third party mark a PMF on their behalf, that it need not be recorded in the bound book if it was under their supervision and returned the same day. So that's just a repeat of that prior statement. If it does have to be recorded into the bound book, the method is, again, first three, last five of the FFL number and that unique identifier number that I had mentioned, separated by a hyphen. And again, if the PMF had prior serial numbers, they must be separated by a semicolon. So you might be thinking, well, if I've got this PMF, I need to record it in my bound book. I don't know who the manufacturer is. Am I the manufacturer and so forth? Well, ATF has gone so far as to modify the structure of the bound book record, which you'll see in a second, such that the first column includes privately made firearm or PMF, and you are to put PMF in those fields. As I had also stated earlier, I think it's unclear as to whether or not other markings need to be applied to that PMF, or at least it's not stated in the particular ruling. But if the model were unknown, as would be today, it's appropriate to put unknown there in the records. And so here's just a graphical representation taken out of the ruling, where you can see there in the first column, you have the addition of the PMF in both the importer, manufacturer, and dealers A&D records. What still continues to amaze me in an open question we have of ATF, if you look at the left side of the bound book, the column order still differs. So, you go PMF type model, and the bottom one you go, manufacturer, importer, PMF, then you go model serial number. Most people who use bound books or electronic bound books these days actually have moved the serial number to be the first column for ease of use anyways. ATF Form 2. So this is an important one. It used to be filed within 24 hours before the end of the next business day. As soon as something that was to become an NFA device, was at that point and serialized as such. Now the ATF is allowing you to wait until the end of the manufacturing process. So let's take as an example a machine gun receiver that has not been assembled into a machine gun yet. So the machine gun receiver, the Form 2 notification can be filed at the very end of the manufacturing process. This also, is really applicable to other rifle and shotgun makers. I should say short barrel rifle and short barrel rifle, short barrel shotgun manufacturers who might have different barrel configurations that they take on and put off during the manufacturing process. And it used to create confusion because the wrong information would be on the form too. This allows people to get around that. So, sorry, I rushed through that just to keep on time. We're going to turn over now to Camden, who's going to talk about record retention. I am seeing the questions stack up here, so I'm going to try and answer some of those on the side while Camden is chatting. So Camden, over to you.
Okay, I'm back. Hey, John, thank you for that. Thank you, very informative. And I do see we've got a lot of great questions stacking up. So I did want to go through record retention very briefly. There's not a ton of information here, but it's important. And so let's go to the next slide and start out here. And this is something y'all may have heard of already. And let's see if we can flip this thing to the next slide. Yeah. Okay. The big change is the fact that any records related to the A&D book are now going to be kept forever, permanent record keeping. Okay. So imagine any kind of 4473s, theft loss reports, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So you need to plan ahead for this. As John mentioned, we are hopefully going to be in a world where you don't have to have a variance for electronic records, but we're not there yet. So you just need to remember you're going to have to plan ahead that you can't discard anything now. Now, take a look at your list of what you can and can't do currently. For example, your A&D book as a retailer, 20 years, your 4473s, 20 years, et cetera. Everything's going to turn permanent. That always is, of course, a storage headache because now you're talking about extending indefinitely. And so they are allowing storage of records offsite at a warehouse if you have that option available. But of course, that falls under the rule that it can only be for storage and not for other purposes. You can't do other business activities there. Okay. That would be the provision that, for example, if you're storing your firearms or ammunition inventory there in your warehouse, you can also store your records. One important point I wanted to point out here. So let's imagine you're sitting there on August 23rd, and as of the 24th, all your records then now become permanent. As of August 23rd, the day before this goes in effect, you're still under the current rule scheme. So what I would suggest to you is take a look at your records currently and say, for example, hypothetically, if you for some reason still have some 4473s sitting around from the 90s, I think it's a fair reading of this regulation that on August 24th, those become permanent records, even though under the current regulations, they are not and could be eliminated from your inventory of records. So I think it's important that you take a hard look at your record keeping and what you have on hand currently between now and the 24th of August. So that's something to note and something to really pay attention to because we're going to be in a world where you're going to have a record storage issue on your plate that is going to be, rather significant. Now, let's go to the next slide. This is really just a cleanup for you. This is what the ATF did is show, hey, with this new ruling, here's all the stuff that's being affected. And this is really a compendium. Looks like we might be having a hang up, John. We might want to go back up and go back in. And this last slide is really for your reference, kind of a takeaway. If you've got a book or a directory of different rulings and all that, the ATF has said, hey, here's all the different rulings and procedures that are affected by this. You got some that are superseded, some amplified, some clarified. Take that slide as a reference in the sense that if you're keeping track of rulings and being able to go back and reference them as you do your compliance, make sure you understand that this new ruling does affect these lists of old rulings in the manner specified. Okay, so that actually completes my portion of it. I got the light lift this afternoon. So John, do you want to start hitting questions or should I go ahead through with the other slides?
Sorry there. I'll go ahead and take it. Not a problem.
Okay.
So if you can see this, just a reminder, as the disclaimer, nothing here should be interpreted as legal advice, right? And if you do need counsel, please seek counsel from a licensed attorney. There were a lot of definitions in here that were paraphrased or abbreviated, just too much to put on a slide, if you will, and we wanted to hit the highlights. So if you have questions, we're here to answer them, or of course, read the ruling itself. Well, we don't necessarily have a summary slide, if you will, just kind of recalling back to the executive summary, right? There were 5 key areas of the new ruling, which were the definitions, markings, record keeping, record retention, and then the last slide that Camden just covered. Our goal was to provide you information about all of those. If you also recall from the beginning of the presentation, this ruling has implications pretty much to almost every type of FFL. And there are definitely open questions that I know we have and others have. So, additional education and communication is going to be needed from ATF, organizations like ours. I think NSSF recently announced a presentation they're doing as well. So more communication at this point is definitely better than less. With that, assistance is available, small plug, if you will, but Orchid, Williams, Mullen, and FFL Law are here to help. We've already been contacted by a number of our clients to help them plan for the future, how it's going to impact either their compliance or, in many cases, their manufacturing or retail operations or the software that they are using. Clearly, the organizations presented there have different areas of expertise. Williams Mullen being a very large law firm, FFL Law being much smaller and focused, and of course, Orchid much broader in the area of operational compliance and technology. So, impact assessments related to the new ruling, classifying firearms, submitting variances, modifying your systems, taking advantage of new digital storage. We've been asked to do a lot of zero tolerance, quick hit audits. Hey, come check out my operation. I don't want to get tripped up over one item. So that could definitely save your license. Revocations hearings are definitely up. So legal services related to the defense and a revocation, compliance policy, and educating your employees on matters of things like that we've talked about today. Again, those were our speakers, with the exception of Phil, who just helped us create these materials. So I appreciate that. I think we have a few minutes, and I'm going to try and answer some of these questions. So if you're still on and you want to hear them, here we go. I think we've got about 12 minutes to go. So let me read through here. Okay, so here's a question, and this is very similar to many of the questions that have come through here. As an FFL holder and manufacturer of lower receivers, will 80% lowers that we receive to finish machining be required to be serialized before we receive them? Goes back again to the discussion we had with ATF last week, and they kept saying there's no such thing as 80% lower, right? So what they keep coming back to is you have to look at the definition of a partially completed firearm. And unfortunately, the vague terminology around readily and clearly identifiable. We hope that they provide additional clarity around readily and clearly identifiable, I would say. But they have also said that you can send in items into the technology, or FAT-D, I should say, for classification. But I would usually compare and contrast the traditional strip lower that individuals were, calling 80% lowers in the past versus a forging. Those prior 80% lowers, if they're far enough along the process, without a doubt, they would have to be serialized and recorded before you receive them. That's a big change. There's one other thing that I can't remember if we actually spoke to or not, but ATF said any partially completed firearms, which is in the lingo of many folks on this call, an 80%er, though that shouldn't apply, had previously been classified by ATF's FAT-D branch are grandfathered in. You do not need to send them back in. There was a little debate around that topic, and they don't want to see them again. All right, let me find some more here. Question is, if we make lowers for another company with their logo, which address would have to be on the lower? Some companies want to make it look like their company. I think we're talking about the difference between requesting a marking variance, right, versus further manufacturing under what was now, or what has now become superseded 2009-5. Absent a marking variance, if you're modifying the firearm, you would have to put your markings on it. If you have a marking variance, then no, you would not. If you are an FFL and you personally own a PMF in your personal collection, does this still apply? So while that is not explicitly written and answered in the ruling, I would look at it from the following perspective. If the PMFs are yours and they have nothing to do with the business, let's say they're not on the premise, maybe a condition where they do come to the premise, but they're not intended to be an owned asset of the licensee itself, it's just you, the person, then I would think, no, if it's in your personal collection, that, it does not apply. I think the moment that you intend to put that asset into, the business, then it would apply. Next question is, what if the PMF is 100% polymer with no metal plate? Makes me think of a rapid prototyping scenario, and that's a great question. I don't know the answer to. I think we'll have to get back to you on that one. All right. I think the rest of these we will answer and get back to the group in writing. So, Chuck and Camden, anything else from yourselves? If not, let's go ahead and consider that a wrap. And we are going to be holding a follow-up webinar that'll be announced soon. The open items that we mentioned will be addressed at that point. If you have questions in the meantime, please don't hesitate to reach out and ask. So thank you all very much, and we appreciate it. Bye-bye.